The year is 1946. Japan lies in ruins. Cities are reduced to ash, families torn apart, and millions are left with nothing. Among them is a woman named Haruko Yamamoto. She had served as a nurse in the Imperial Japanese Army, captured by Allied forces, and held in a prisoner of war camp for 2 years. When the war finally ended, she was released with only $20 to her name. $20 to rebuild a life in a country that no longer existed as she knew it. This is the story of how one unexpected encounter with an American stranger would shock everyone and change her life forever. Haruko stepped off the transport truck onto the broken streets of Tokyo in September 1946. The city she once knew was unrecognizable. Where grand buildings once stood, there were only skeletal frames and piles of rubble. The air smelled of ash and despair. She clutched a small cloth bag containing everything she owned. A change of clothes, her release papers, and $20 in American currency. The military officer who handed it to her at the camp gate had said it was standard compensation for former POWs. $20. She had laughed bitterly. She had. What could $20 buy in a country where food was scarce and hope even scarcer? She made her way through the crowded streets, stepping over debris and avoiding the hollow eyes of other survivors. Children with dirt-smudged faces begged for scraps. Women lined up at distribution centers hoping for rice rations. Men with missing limbs sat on street corners, their military uniforms tattered and faded. Haruko felt the weight of their stares. She knew what they saw. A woman who had been captured, who had survived while so many others had perished. Shame burned in her chest, but she pushed it down. Survival was all that mattered now. Her destination was the small neighborhood where her family had lived before the war. She prayed that someone, anyone, would still be there. As she walked, memories flooded back. Her mother's smile, her father's stern but loving voice, her younger brother Takeshi's laughter. She hadn't heard from them in over 3 years. Letters had stopped coming to the camp after the bombing of Hiroshima. Fear gnawed at her, but she forced her feet to keep moving. When she finally reached the street where her family home had stood, her heart sank. The entire block was gone, reduced to a field of ash and twisted metal. She fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Everything was gone. Everyone was gone. She was alone in a world that had moved on without her. For a long moment she considered giving up, lying down among the ruins and letting the earth reclaim her. But something deep inside, some stubborn spark of will, refused to let her surrender. Haruko spent her first night in Tokyo huddled in the corner of a bombed-out building, sharing space with other homeless survivors. She used $5 to buy a small bag of rice and some pickled vegetables from a black market vendor. The food would last her maybe a week if she was careful. She needed to find work, but who would hire a former POW? The stigma was too great. She was tainted by capture, by survival, by association with defeat. Days turned into weeks. Haruko took odd jobs wherever she could find them, cleaning debris, washing clothes for wealthier families who had somehow survived with their fortunes intact, even begging when desperation became too great. Her $20 dwindled to 15, then 10, then 5. She grew thinner. Her clothes hung loose on her frame and the spark in her eyes began to fade. She moved from one temporary shelter to another, always one step ahead of complete destitution. One cold October morning, Haruko was sweeping the entrance of a small shop in exchange for a bowl of soup, when she heard a commotion down the street. A crowd had gathered around something, voices raised in anger and fear. Curiosity drew her closer. In the center of the crowd stood an American soldier, tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform clean and pressed. He was arguing with a Japanese shopkeeper, gesturing frantically. The shopkeeper shook his head, pointing at the soldier and shouting in Japanese. Haruko pushed through the crowd to see what was happening. The American soldier looked frustrated, clearly unable to understand what the shopkeeper was saying. The crowd grew more agitated, and Haruko saw the situation escalating. Without thinking, she stepped forward and spoke in English, a language she had learned during her nursing training. "Excuse me, can I help?" The soldier turned to her, relief flooding his face. "Thank God, someone who speaks English. I'm trying to buy medicine for a sick child, but I think there's been a misunderstanding." Haruko translated between the soldier and the shopkeeper. It turned out the soldier, whose name was Robert Sullivan but who insisted everyone call him Bobby, had been trying to help a local family whose daughter was ill with fever. He wanted to buy medicine, But the shopkeeper thought he was trying to requisition supplies without payment, a common practice among some occupation forces. Once the misunderstanding was cleared, the shopkeeper softened and sold Bobby the medicine. Bobby thanked Haruko profusely, asking if he could buy her lunch as a gesture of gratitude. Haruko hesitated. Being seen with an American soldier could bring trouble, but hunger won out over caution, and she agreed. They walked to a small noodle shop that had recently reopened. As they ate, Bobby asked about her story. Something in his kind eyes and genuine manner made Haruko open up. She told him about the POW camp, about returning to find her family gone, about the $20 that was supposed to be a new start but felt more like a cruel joke. Bobby listened without judgment, his expression growing more somber with each detail. When she finished, Bobby was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised her. "I served in the Pacific Theater. I was at Okinawa. I saw terrible things, did terrible things. When the war ended, I thought I could just go home and forget, but the memories followed me. I volunteered to stay on with the occupation forces because I needed to do something good, something to balance out all the destruction. Maybe helping you is part of that." Haruko didn't know what to say. She had expected pity or condescension, but Bobby offered neither. Instead, he treated her like an equal, someone worthy of respect and dignity. Before they parted ways, Bobby pressed something into her hand. When she looked down, she saw it was $50. Her eyes widened in shock. "I can't accept this," she protested. Bobby shook his head firmly. "Yes, you can. Consider it a loan if that makes it easier. Pay me back when you're back on your feet." He scribbled an address on a piece of paper. "This is where I'm stationed. Come find me if you need anything." Haruko watched him walk away, the money clutched in her trembling hand. $50. Combined with the few dollars she had left, it was more money than she had seen in years. But more than the money, it was the gesture itself that moved her. A stranger, an enemy soldier, had shown her more kindness than anyone in her own country since her return. That night she allowed herself to hope for the first time since the war ended. With the money Bobby had given her, Haruko was able to rent a tiny room in a boarding house and buy proper food. She used some of the funds to purchase basic medical supplies and began offering nursing services to her neighbors. Word spread quickly that a trained nurse was available, and soon she had a steady stream of patients. Most couldn't pay much, but every yen helped. She was building something, slowly but surely. A month after their first meeting, Haruko went to the address Bobby had given her. She wanted to thank him properly and, if possible, begin repaying the loan. The address led to a military administrative building. She approached nervously, aware of the stares from American soldiers and Japanese civilians alike. When she asked for Bobby Sullivan, she was directed to an office on the second floor. Bobby's face lit up when he saw her. "Haruko, you came. I was hoping you would. How are you doing?" She told him about the room, the nursing work, the small steps toward rebuilding her life. Bobby listened with genuine interest, asking questions and offering encouragement. When she tried to give him money toward repaying the loan, he waved it off. "Keep it. You need it more than I do. But if you really want to help me, I have a proposition." Bobby explained that he had been working with a humanitarian relief organization that was trying to provide medical care to underserved areas outside Tokyo. They desperately needed trained medical personnel, especially those who could communicate with local populations. Would Haruko be interested in working with them? The pay wasn't much, but it was steady, and the work was meaningful. Haruko agreed immediately. It was exactly the kind of opportunity she had been hoping for. Working with the relief organization brought Haruko into regular contact with Bobby. They traveled together to rural villages, setting up temporary clinics and treating everything from malnutrition to war injuries. Bobby proved to be a dedicated worker, never complaining about long hours or difficult conditions. Haruko saw a different side of Americans through him, one that contradicted everything she had been taught during the war. He wasn't a demon or a monster. He was just a man trying to do good in a broken world. As weeks turned into months, Haruko and Bobby developed a deep friendship. They shared meals, swapped stories about their lives before the war, and found comfort in each other's company. Bobby told her about his family back in Ohio, about his father who worked in a steel mill and his mother who made the best apple pie in the county. Haruko told him about her childhood in Tokyo, about studying nursing against her father's wishes, about her brother Takeshi who had dreamed of becoming an engineer. One evening, as they sat on the steps of a village schoolhouse after a long day of treating patients, Bobby turned to Haruko with a serious expression. "There's something I need to tell you. I've been trying to find information about your family. I have some connections through the military, access to records. I found something about your brother." Haruko's heart stopped. Her hands trembled as Bobby pulled out a folded paper from his jacket. "He's alive, Haruko. Takeshi is alive. He's in Hiroshima, at a rehabilitation center for wounded veterans." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Alive. Takeshi was alive. Tears poured down Haruko's face as relief and joy overwhelmed her. Bobby smiled gently. "I can arrange transport for you to go see him if you want." Haruko could barely speak through her tears. "Thank you, Bobby. Thank you so much." She wanted to say more, to express the depth of her gratitude, but words failed her. Bobby simply squeezed her hand and said, "That's what friends are for." The journey to Hiroshima was long and difficult, but Haruko barely noticed. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of Takeshi. What would he look like? Would he recognize her? Would he be happy to see her? When she finally arrived at the rehabilitation center, a nurse directed her to a courtyard where patients were taking afternoon sun. There, sitting in a wheelchair with one leg missing below the knee, was Takeshi. He looked older, harder, the boyish softness gone from his face, but it was unmistakably him. "Takeshi," she called out, her voice breaking. He turned, confusion crossing his face, then recognition, then shock. "Haruko? Is that really you?" She ran to him, falling to her knees beside his wheelchair and embracing him fiercely. They held each other and wept, years of separation and pain pouring out in that moment. When they finally pulled apart, Takeshi's expression was complicated. "I thought you were dead. They told us you had been captured and then we heard nothing. Mother and father, they died in the firebombing of Tokyo. I was in Hiroshima when the Americans dropped the bomb." Haruko listened as Takeshi recounted his own story of survival, of losing his leg, of the months of painful recovery. His voice was bitter when he spoke of Americans, filled with rage at what had been done to their country. Haruko told him about her own journey, about the POW camp, about returning to find their home destroyed. Then she told him about Bobby, about the money and the job, and the help in finding Takeshi himself. As she spoke, Takeshi's expression darkened. "You're working with Americans? With the people who did this to us?" He gestured at his missing leg, at the scarred landscape visible through the courtyard windows. "How can you betray our people like that?" The accusation stung, but Haruko kept her voice calm. "I'm not betraying anyone. I'm helping people. Japanese people who need medical care. Bobby isn't our enemy anymore, Takeshi. The war is over. We have to find a way to move forward." But Takeshi shook his head angrily. "The war may be over, but I'll never forgive them. Never." He turned his wheelchair away from her, his back rigid with fury. "I think you should leave." Haruko's heart broke all over again. She had found her brother only to discover a chasm between them that seemed impossible to bridge. She left the rehabilitation center with a heavy heart, wondering if some wounds were too deep to ever heal. When she returned to Tokyo and told Bobby what had happened, he listened quietly. "I understand his anger. I can't imagine what he's been through. Give him time, Haruko. Sometimes that's all we can do." Despite Takeshi's rejection, Haruko continued her work with the relief organization. She threw herself into helping others, finding purpose in easing suffering wherever she could. Bobby remained a constant presence, a steady friend who never asked for anything in return. Their partnership became well known in the communities they served, and slowly attitudes began to shift. People saw that not all Americans were conquerors, and not all Japanese were defeated enemies. They were just people trying to survive and rebuild. One day, about 6 months after their reunion, Haruko received a letter from Takeshi. It was brief and awkward, but it was a start. He wrote that he had been thinking about what she said, about moving forward. He wasn't ready to forgive, but he wanted to try to understand. Would she come visit again? Haruko's hands shook as she read the letter. It was a small opening, but it was enough. She immediately made plans to return to Hiroshima. This time, when she arrived at the rehabilitation center, Takeshi greeted her with a tentative smile. They talked for hours, really talked, about their pain and their fears and their hopes for the future. Takeshi admitted that his anger had been consuming him, making it impossible to see anything beyond his own suffering. Watching Haruko work to heal others had made him question his own bitterness. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. "Maybe holding on to hate will only destroy what's left of us." Haruko told Takeshi more about Bobby, about his kindness and his own struggles with war guilt. She explained how Bobby had used his position and resources to help countless Japanese civilians, never asking for recognition or reward. Takeshi listened, his expression thoughtful. "I'd like to meet him," he said finally. "This man who helped my sister." Haruko's heart soared. She knew it was a huge step for Takeshi, and she was determined to make the meeting happen. She arranged for Bobby to travel to Hiroshima the following week. The day of the meeting, Haruko was nervous. She had no idea how Takeshi and Bobby would react to each other. When Bobby arrived at the rehabilitation center, she led him to the courtyard where Takeshi waited. The two men stared at each other for a long moment, the weight of history heavy between them. Then Takeshi spoke in halting English. "My sister tells me you saved her life." Bobby shook his head. "She saved her own life. I just gave her a little help along the way." Takeshi studied Bobby carefully, then extended his hand. "Thank you for helping her, for helping our people." Bobby shook his hand firmly. "It's the least I could do. I'm sorry for what happened to you, to your country. I know my apology doesn't change anything, but I mean it." Takeshi's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "War makes monsters of us all. Maybe it's time we stopped being monsters." The two men talked for over an hour, sharing their experiences and their pain. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was understanding, and that was a beginning. As the months passed, something unexpected happened. Bobby's actions began to attract attention, both positive and negative. Some American military personnel praised his humanitarian work, while others criticized him for being too sympathetic to the former enemy. Among his critics was his former commanding officer, Colonel Robert Harrison, who summoned Bobby to his office one day for a serious conversation. Colonel Harrison was a stern man with a distinguished military career. He sat behind his desk, his expression disapproving as Bobby stood at attention. "Sullivan, I've been hearing concerning reports about your activities. You've been spending an inappropriate amount of time with Japanese civilians, particularly a former POW. This is raising questions about your judgment and loyalty." Bobby kept his voice respectful but firm. "Sir, I'm following the occupation's stated goals of rebuilding and reconciliation. Everything I've done has been within regulations." The colonel leaned back in his chair. "Regulations aren't the issue, Sullivan. It's about appearances. You're getting too close to these people. Some are saying you've gone native, that you've forgotten which side you fought for." Bobby felt anger rise in his chest but pushed it down. "With respect, sir, the war is over. There are no sides anymore, just people trying to survive. We won the war, but that doesn't mean we should abandon our humanity in the peace." Colonel Harrison's expression softened slightly. "I understand your idealism, Sullivan, but the world isn't that simple. There are people back home who lost sons and brothers to the Japanese. How do you think they'd feel knowing American soldiers are fraternizing with the enemy?" Bobby met his gaze steadily. "I think they'd want their sacrifices to mean something. I think they'd want us to build a better world, not just perpetuate the cycle of hatred. Isn't that what we fought for?" The colonel was silent for a long moment, then sighed. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Sullivan. Probably both. I can't officially support what you're doing, but I won't stop you either. Just be careful. There are people watching, and not all of them are as understanding as I am." Bobby saluted. "Thank you, sir. I'll be careful." As he left the office, he felt the weight of the colonel's warning. He knew his actions were controversial, but he couldn't stop now. Too much was at stake. The controversy surrounding Bobby reached a peak when a journalist from an American newspaper got wind of his story. The reporter, looking for a human interest piece about the occupation, interviewed Bobby and Haruko about their work with the relief organization. The resulting article, titled, "From Enemies to Allies, An American Soldier's Mission of Mercy," was published in several major newspapers back in the United States. The response was immediate and divided. Some readers praised Bobby as a hero, an example of American generosity and compassion. They sent letters of support and even donations for the relief work. But others were outraged, accusing Bobby of betraying his country and dishonoring the memory of fallen soldiers. The controversy made its way back to the military command, and Bobby found himself under increased scrutiny. There were calls for his reassignment, even suggestions of disciplinary action. Through it all, Haruko stood by Bobby's side. She gave her own interview to a Japanese newspaper, talking about how one American soldier's kindness had saved her life and inspired her to help others. Her story resonated with many Japanese who were struggling to reconcile their wartime hatred with the reality of the occupation. It sparked conversations about forgiveness, reconciliation, and the possibility of moving beyond the past. The pressure on Bobby intensified when his friend and fellow soldier Tom O'Brien confronted him one evening. Tom had served alongside Bobby at Okinawa and had seen some of the worst fighting of the war. He cornered Bobby in the barracks, his face flushed with anger. "What the hell are you doing, Bobby? I read that article. You're making us all look like fools. We fought those people, watched our friends die because of them, and now you're playing savior?" Bobby tried to stay calm. "Tom, the war is over. These people aren't our enemies anymore." Tom's voice rose. "They'll always be the enemy. You can't just forget what they did, what we went through. My brother died on a beach in the Philippines, Bobby. He was 19 years old, and you're out there helping the people who killed him." Bobby felt the weight of Tom's pain. "I'm not forgetting anything. I carry those memories every day. But if we don't try to build something better, then what did your brother die for? Just more hatred and violence?" Tom stared at him, conflict warring in his eyes. Then he shook his head and walked away. Bobby knew he had lost a friend, but he couldn't regret his choices. The path he had chosen was difficult and lonely, but it was the right one. He thought about Haruko, about Takeshi, about all the people they had helped. That had to count for something. That had to be worth the cost. As winter approached, Bobby made a decision that would shock everyone even more than his previous actions. He requested a discharge from the military so he could stay in Japan permanently and continue his humanitarian work. When Haruko heard the news, she was stunned. "Bobby, you can't give up everything for this. What about your family? Your life back home?" Bobby smiled gently. "This is my life now. This work, these people, you. It matters more to me than anything else. I've found my purpose here." The discharge request caused an uproar. Colonel Harrison called Bobby in again, this time with genuine concern on his face. "Sullivan, think about what you're doing. You're throwing away your military career, your benefits, everything you've earned. And for what? To stay in a country that will never fully accept you?" Bobby stood firm. "Sir, I've thought about nothing else for weeks. This is what I need to do." The colonel studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the biggest fool. Maybe both. Your discharge is approved. Good luck, Sullivan. You're going to need it." News of Bobby's decision spread quickly through both the American military community and the Japanese civilians they worked with. Reactions were mixed. Some Americans thought he was crazy, throwing away his future for people who would never appreciate it. But others, including some who had initially criticized him, began to see his actions in a different light. Maybe there was something noble in his choice, something that spoke to the better angels of human nature. Among the Japanese, Bobby's decision was met with astonishment and increasingly respect. Here was an American who had fought against them, who had every reason to hate them, choosing instead to dedicate his life to helping them rebuild. It challenged assumptions and opened minds. Haruko was deeply moved, though she worried about what Bobby was giving up. When she tried to express her concerns, he took her hands in his. "Haruko, you gave me back something I thought I'd lost in the war. You reminded me that there's still good in the world, still reasons to hope. Let me do this." With his discharge finalized, Bobby threw himself fully into the relief work. He and Haruko expanded their operations, setting up more clinics in rural areas and training local volunteers in basic medical care. They worked with Grace Liu, the Chinese-American relief worker who had become a trusted friend and ally. Grace brought her own perspective to their work, having experienced prejudice from both Americans and Japanese. Together, the three of them formed an unlikely but effective team. One of their most ambitious projects was establishing a rehabilitation center for wounded veterans like Takeshi. Bobby used his connections and the donations that had poured in from supporters back in America to secure funding and supplies. Takeshi became involved in the planning, offering insights from his own experience. Working together on the project helped cement the bond between Bobby and Takeshi, transforming them from wary acquaintances into genuine friends. The rehabilitation center opened in the spring of 1948, 2 years after Haruko and Bobby's first meeting. It was a modest facility, but it offered hope to men who had been forgotten by their own government. Veterans received not just medical care, but also job training and psychological support. Takeshi became one of the center's first counselors, using his own journey from bitterness to healing as inspiration for others. At the opening ceremony, he gave a speech that brought many to tears. He spoke about losing his leg, about the anger that had consumed him, about wanting revenge against the Americans who had destroyed his country. Then he talked about meeting Bobby, about seeing an enemy become a friend, about learning that the path forward wasn't through hatred but through understanding. "We cannot change the past," Takeshi said, his voice strong and clear. "We cannot undo the suffering or bring back those we've lost, but we can choose what we do with our pain. We can let it destroy us or we can use it to build something better. This center is proof that even from the ashes of war, hope can grow." Bobby stood in the back of the crowd, listening to Takeshi's words with tears streaming down his face. Haruko stood beside him, her hand in his. She squeezed his fingers gently and he squeezed back. They had come so far from that chance meeting on a Tokyo street, from $20 and a desperate hope. They had built something real, something lasting, something that mattered, and they had done it together. As the months and years passed, Bobby and Haruko's relationship deepened into something more than friendship. It was a slow evolution, born from mutual respect and shared purpose. They never spoke directly about their feelings, but they didn't need to. It was there in every glance, every touch, every moment of quiet companionship. Those around them saw it, even if they didn't acknowledge it themselves. Grace teased them gently about it, and Takeshi gave his quiet approval. In the spring of 1949, Bobby finally gathered the courage to speak his heart. They were sitting on a hillside overlooking one of the villages where they had established a clinic. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom, painting the landscape in shades of pink and white. Bobby turned to Haruko, his expression serious. "There's something I need to tell you. I know our situation is complicated, and I know there are 1,000 reasons why this is a bad idea, but I can't keep it to myself anymore. I love you, Haruko. I think I've loved you since that first day when you stepped forward to help me, even though you had every reason to walk away." Haruko's eyes filled with tears. "Bobby, I love you too. I have for a long time. But what kind of future can we have? You're American. I'm Japanese. The world won't accept us." Bobby took her hands in his. "I don't care what the world thinks. We've already defied expectations, already proven that enemies can become friends, that hatred can transform into love. If we can do all that, we can find a way to be together." Haruko smiled through her tears. "Then we'll find a way." Their decision to marry was met with predictable opposition. Some Americans accused Bobby of betraying his race and country. Some Japanese accused Haruko of selling out to the occupiers. But there were also supporters, people who had witnessed their work and their dedication, who understood that love could transcend the boundaries of nation and history. Colonel Harrison, who had become an unlikely ally over the years, offered to officiate the wedding. Tom O'Brien, who had eventually reconciled with Bobby, stood as best man. The wedding was small and simple, held at the rehabilitation center they had built together. Takeshi walked his sister down the aisle, his prosthetic leg clicking softly on the wooden floor. Grace Liu stood as maid of honor, her face radiant with joy. Mrs. Fumiko Sato, the elderly neighbor who had befriended Haruko in her darkest days, wept openly. As Bobby and Haruko exchanged vows, promising to love and support each other through whatever challenges lay ahead, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. In the years that followed, Bobby and Haruko continued their humanitarian work, expanding their reach and impact. They adopted 2 war orphans, giving them a home and a future. They trained dozens of medical workers, established multiple clinics, and touched thousands of lives. Their story became a symbol of reconciliation and hope, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal, that even the bitterest enemies could find common ground. They never forgot where they started, with $20 and a chance encounter on a broken street in Tokyo. Decades later, when journalists asked Bobby why he had done it, why he had given up everything to help a former enemy, his answer was always the same. "Because she needed help and I was in a position to give it. Because I was tired of destruction and wanted to build something instead. Because in her eyes, I saw not an enemy but a human being who deserved dignity and compassion." It wasn't complicated. It was just the right thing to do. And Haruko, when asked what she thought about that day when a stranger gave her $50 and changed her life, would smile and say, "He gave me much more than money. He gave me hope when I had none, purpose when I was lost, and love when I thought I'd never feel it again. That's worth more than all the money in the world." Their story reminds us that even in the darkest times, even when the world is torn apart by hatred and violence, individual acts of kindness can spark transformation. One person reaching across the divide, offering help without expectation of return, can create ripples that spread far beyond what we can imagine. Bobby Sullivan didn't set out to change the world. He just wanted to help one person. But that one person helped another, and another, and another, until the impact was immeasurable. That's the power of compassion, the strength of human connection, the miracle that happens when we choose love over hate. If this story moved you, if it inspired you or gave you hope, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of courage, compassion, and the indomitable human spirit. Hit that like button and leave a comment telling us what you think. What would you have done in Bobby's situation? Have you ever experienced an unexpected act of kindness that changed your life? Share your stories with us. Together, we can keep these important lessons alive and continue to build bridges across the divides that separate us. Thank you for watching, and remember that every one of us has the power to make a difference, one act of kindness at a time.